But I believe that by overwhelming majority in all the Americas, you and I, in the long run, and if it be necessary, you and I will act together to protect, to defend, by every means at our command.
Welcome to the History in Motion podcast, where we discuss leaders, their decisions, and how they shape the world we live in today. In this episode of the History in Motion podcast, we dive into the rise of Emperor Aurelian, the soldier who restored a shattered Roman Empire. In just 5 years, he defeated enemies on all fronts, reunited a broken realm, and changed the course of Roman history. This is a story of a man who saved Rome, then vanished at the height of his power. This is the History in Motion podcast.
Welcome back, everyone, to another episode of the History in Motion podcast, where today we're heading back into ancient times and into ancient Rome, but a little bit later in the Roman Empire than we've traveled before. And this is starting to look like the beginning of the end for the Roman Empire. It's really starting to decline, but there's one man, and that's the Emperor Aurelian, who's going to take what is really a fractured empire and bring it back together and really set up the next 100 to 150 years for Rome to actually become a superpower once again. Even though it still may have been a superpower, it was really starting to decline at this point. And so what I'm really excited about in this episode is, we're going to set the scene pretty well, and you're probably going to start to look at Rome at this point, and if you didn't know the end of this story, or maybe you didn't know your timeline exactly when the Roman Empire fell, you might say, they're going to talk about when the Roman Empire fell, and this Aurelian guy is probably the last emperor. It's we're not quite there yet. There's some repairing that has to be done, and that's going to be all be done by Aurelian.
I think that's a great intro. I didn't know much about Aurelian before we started doing research for this particular episode, and I think it's one of those historical figures where I feel like I should have known about them before recording, just because of how effective his reign was. However short it was, as we'll get into, it's got to be one of the most impactful reigns to kind of set the course of what will be the Roman Empire hereafter his legacy.
Yeah, I'm gonna steal something from Mike Duncan, who's the expert on Rome and any sort of podcasts or books or anything. Typically Mike's the guy for this sort of stuff, and he talked about Aurelian in his podcast, The History of Rome, and he said he's a big baseball fan, and he said when you think of great emperors, he thinks of it like the Hall of Famers in baseball. You have these emperors who do a lot of great stuff over a long period of time. Like a baseball pitcher might pitch for 20 years, but you might have this player who shows up for 7-8 seasons and plays at a ridiculously high level and then never really gets back to that level, or retires early because of injuries. He kind of compared it to Aurelian, and I think for that sports analogy here works really well because, like you were saying, Richie, he doesn't last very long as emperor, but when we go through all the things that he's able to accomplish, he may have the highest peak, maybe of any emperor. It's debatable for sure, but when we look at a lot of the emperors, there's a lot of great things they're able to do over a long period of time, but most of the great emperors didn't get handed an empire that was, fractured to this degree, dealing with all of these problems, and able to not just put it back together, but even make it to a point where it's, almost set up perfectly for the next person to take over.
Yeah, and I know we'll get into it, but, the Roman Empire, when he takes the throne as emperor, is very fragmented. It's beset by invasions, civil wars, which seem pretty common in Rome at this time. There's the potential of economic collapse and also contending with a plague. So, the Rome that he's inheriting is not an easy one to govern over in any way, shape, or form.
Yeah, and I think that's a good segue to, what is this Rome that he's taking over? What is this Roman Empire that he's inherited? And so, we've talked about a bunch of Roman emperors on this show, and we've talked about, Augustus and Julius Caesar, and really building this powerhouse of an empire. And then we've talked about someone like Marcus Aurelius, who's bringing in that Pax Romana, that Roman peace, just this really affluent time in Roman's history. But then we talked about Commodus, and things started to slip a little bit. We talked about Caracalla and Geta. Things were starting to slip a little bit. And really, when we get to the point of Caracalla and Geta, and specifically their father, Septimius Severus, he looked at everything that Commodus was doing, and that was selling off positions to the highest bidder, basically making a mockery of what the Senate used to be, and really making a mockery of what the emperor should be at this point. And so when Septimius Severus takes over, he basically tells his sons, and he does it by his actions as well, is the army is the only thing that really matters at this point. The Senate and the people, you can be a populist, you can make the people happy, but you have to make sure that the army is behind you. And this is what's going to really spur the next 100 years of Roman history, because the army is going to dictate who's in power, which was not always the case. It was a mix of the people, the Senate, and of course the military always had a part to play, but this has really changed. And so the 3rd century is really just known as the crisis of the 3rd century. And it's really about a 50 to 60 year period where Alexander Severus is murdered in 235 by his troops. And this kind of kicks off about 50 years of just basically the age of anarchy, rapid political instability, dozens of usurpers, emperors rising and falling. So like if you look at a list of Roman emperors, you'll start to see very quickly around this time period, you'll see emperors in there for 2 months. You'll see emperors in there for a year and a half. And they always end with assassination by their troops, assassination by somebody else. And during this time, Rome had around, we'll say 26 legitimate emperors in 50 years, but you had many more rebel claimants, and we only have one emperor who dies of natural causes. So just to give you an idea, it is pandemonium out there. 50 years of just civil war on top of civil war, troops hailing their general emperor, and then they're marching on Rome, taking power. They don't last very long, and the cycle just keeps continuing. And so with all this infighting, people on the outside, the Parthians, the soon-to-be Sassanid Empire, which is kind of what they transitioned to out in Persia, which is modern day Iran, and then all of these tribes on the northern border who are looking to find ways to invade and raid Roman lands. This is going to be a great time for them. So really, Rome is in a really difficult spot where everybody's trying to see if they can pick off a piece of Rome while they figure out this infighting, which really seems to have no end because the cycle just keeps continuing.
It's essentially 50 or 60 years of total chaos, right? It's like chaos embodied almost. Military coups, short reigns, assassinations, civil war, and absolutely like no degree of continuity or trust in the process. And, just on top of that too, the icing on top of the cake, a plague. This is something that stuck out to me that I think is pretty interesting. So the plague of Cyprian. So it wasn't just a plague in, the way that we would think about it. If you think about it in terms of the framing that we've set up, this is like a gut punch to an already collapsing empire in so many ways. It's a deadly pandemic, and I think some historians believe it was probably smallpox, measles, or something like, Ebola, if we're giving a common day reference. It was named after Saint Cyprian, which is the bishop of Carthage. There was no cure, no immunity, and it spread across the empire at lightning speed. It's estimated, and I would take these numbers with a grain of salt, that, thousands were dying daily in major cities like Rome. So what does this mean? This means military recruitment's going to suffer, farms and cities are being abandoned, and, maybe Romans are starting to see it as kind of this divine punishment. So it's increasing social anxiety and religious desperation. And I think there's even instances of people, contending with the idea of sacrificing to get the gods back on their side.
Yeah, this is something that really hits Rome really hard. And we saw it around like the time of Marcus Aurelius, and it continues to happen, these really nasty plagues. And like you said, it's important because you need people to run your armies. And this was the thing that Rome always had, that, when we talked about Hannibal, right? It was Hannibal would roll in, destroy an army of 60 to 70,000 Romans. But then next year, there's just another army of 60 to 70,000 Romans. And they just kind of rinse and repeat. They had so much manpower that they were able to kind of continue this military conquest and military defense and just raising new armies so quickly. But as your male population is starting to get destroyed by these plagues, now you have less troops to defend your border, less people to settle your lands, less tax revenue. And so it really starts to conflate these problems. And the Roman military has changed so much at this time, partially because of this. They're starting to bring in more auxiliary forces, which are essentially barbarians. So think of Germanic tribes mostly, who are coming over the border and essentially working as mercenaries, or in some cases when a Roman army would win a battle against a barbarian force, sometimes in the peace settlement, they would give them soldiers as a essentially peace offering. And so we're starting to see more and more of this. And this is really continuing to happen throughout the crisis of the 3rd century, where you're getting repeated invasions now by these barbarian groups. So think of things like the Goths, the Alemanni are one. And there's one that's really interesting called the Franks. And so, spoiler alert, Franks, very similar for a reason. The Frankish Empire will essentially rise in France one day. So there's somebody to keep in mind for, future episodes. And even during this time, the Sassanid Persian Empire, which comes after the Parthian Empire, which basically is, like we said, the new Persian Empire, actually captures an emperor. So Emperor Valerian is captured in the year 260. And so this is the first time an emperor not only has been captured captured by the enemy, but captured by the Persians, which is like Rome's greatest enemy of all time. And so it just seems like Rome is just struggling at this point. They're losing men, they're losing manpower, emperors are getting captured, they're fighting each other, and their economy stinks at this point. They're really in a severe economic depression. What happens is emperors come in, they want to give the army a raise because, hey, guess what? The army got me in power. And remember, if I don't keep the army happy, we're going to be in big trouble here really quickly. So what do they start doing? They start debasing the currency again. So essentially taking the silver amount that's in a coin and just slowly reducing it. And so what happens? Hyperinflation explodes here. It's essentially the Roman equivalent of printing money. They're making more coins with less silver in them. And so there's areas around the Mediterranean, which was this massive trading area, so much taxes to be collected, so much trade to be done, is really starting to shrink. And now we're starting to see piracy and more of these invasions where there's economic uncertainty, because who knows if the Goths are going to roll over the border and raid a city and go unchecked throughout the Roman Empire. And so there's just a whole bunch of problems that are going on right now. And, we're going to see a very big transition of the Roman Empire. But I was reading from a historian named Dr. Kyle Harper, and he really just says at this point, the empire nearly collapsed, but was ultimately salvaged through dramatic reforms. It was a fundamentally different Rome that we're going to see after Aurelian. But this really could have been when Rome basically broke apart, because it's so large, and to keep this together with all of these problems, it really looked like the writing was on the wall.
It would be hard to say otherwise, right? In terms of just the context we've provided. Rome is on the brink of collapse. I don't think there's any way to argue against it at this point in time. They're facing external threats. They're dealing with their own internal threats. Their economy's on the brink of collapse. There is disease spreading rapidly across the population. This is not something I don't think anyone would willingly want to inherit and rule and govern over, let alone try to consolidate and or strengthen. But I think this is what makes Aurelian so unique as an emperor, and why his story, which is surprisingly overlooked in my opinion, having gone deep into his bio, but I think this is what makes him stand out, and really, going back to that original point of why he may have had the highest peak.
Absolutely, and we'll see that really quickly, but we have to remember, as we set the scene here, I always think of a map, and I just think of little fires going on in different parts of the maps, and emperors trying to run around and deal with something where it's a Gothic invasion over here, and we even see Byzantium get sacked at one point. The Sassanid Empire is invading. Okay, I gotta go deal with them. Okay, now I gotta run back west because some guy in some province decided that he's empire and he's got 20,000 really experienced troops, and if I don't go deal with that, I'm gonna run into a civil war. And he just kind of got all this running around, and we're gonna see that with Aurelian. But there's just it's just a mess, and I think I can't say it enough. And so I think this might be a good time to bring Aurelian on the scene, because barbarian tribes are running wild, usurpers all over the place, and we'll even see that provinces within Rome are starting to, have a little bit of a change of heart as well.
Yeah, what makes Aurelian so unique, right? I think this is going to be the heart of this discussion to a certain degree. How does he end up changing the direction of an entire empire in a very short term? So he was born around 214 CE in the Common Era. Many historians believe he was born to pretty humble beginnings in the Balkan provinces, an area which is known for producing, many of the soldier emperors in that era. Ancient sources kind of differ on his exact birthplace, but most cite modern Serbia. What's certain is that his heritage and upbringing on the Danubian frontier, a region that kind of forged tough soldiers. And one of the, historical resources that we'll be relying on is the Historia Augusta. This is a pretty well documented and used resource by historians, but it's something to be taken with a grain of salt. It's mixed history, potential mix of fanatical propaganda plus a lot of forgery, maybe, because I think there's 6 or 7 authors all using fake names, but it's still one of those resources that are still crucial for analysis, because obviously not many things exist or are still around that could be referenced by modern day historians. So we'll be referencing it a lot, but if it's getting referenced, it probably should be taken very skeptically. But the Historia Augusta does note that he came from a humble family, one of tradition that even claims his mother, and this is going to be important later in the story, was a priestess of the sun god, an eerie prelude to his later later devotion. More crucial than his obscure origins was the character of his early life. He's described as quick-witted and strong. He reportedly practiced weapon drills daily. He mastered the javelin, archery, and hand-to-hand combat long before he wore the imperial robe. So he joined the army likely around the year 235 CE, just as the empire entered its long crisis. So in this chaotic period, merit was still the surest path to power. His battlefield skill and discipline helped him rise swiftly through the ranks, earning him, a reputation as the soldier. One account even claims he executed his sister's son for dereliction of duty. Perhaps this is a bit of a, euphemism for his disciplinary strict nature, but it is still illustrative of his uncompromising character. He's feared, he's respected, and he embodied the martial values needed in this very fractured empire.
I think it's interesting as you're going through that, and we're not trying to use the Historia Augustas as a fact source all the way, trying to use it to fill in some of the gaps. But I always find it interesting when we talk about these great leaders and we try to figure out, okay, what's the propaganda written after versus kind of what's that real story. And you can kind of see that balance here. And, it's one of those things where it's like, yeah, a lot of that's probably true because we do know he was known for being definitely very disciplined, but you just see the way his armies work when we get to that point. Sure, they're very experienced. They're fighting along the Danube. They're dealing with these Gallic tribes and these Germanic tribes all the time. And they're very battle hardened and very disciplined. But there's got to be a leadership element to that. And we'll see with Aurelian too, just how he's able to get his soldiers under control when a lot of generals would just let them run wild or wouldn't be able to control him. So there is a level of respect that he ends up having. And I think he's got to kind of have the good foundation built. So whether these stories are factually true or not, I still think they tell a pretty good story around the type of man that he's going to become.
Yeah, I agree. I think the core characteristics that we can kind of parse out of these stories is what's really important. I think, they're pretty accurate, especially as the story unfolds, throughout his life. A lot of it stays pretty relevant and pertinent to who he is and how he does kind of govern. So by the 260s, he's already become one of Rome's top generals. He's serving under Emperor Gallienus, who relied on him in battle to constantly deal with the threats that Rome was dealing with. And likely during this time, he would have refined his skills in cavalry warfare, possibly even commanding newly formed mobile corps. The Historia Augusta even suggests that he commanded all the cavalry. So here's a great example of an exaggeration, but it is kind of indicative of his overall stature and importance to what's going on. He was known for fighting with distinction against those Germanic tribes and overcame setbacks against other raiders, which had devastated northern Italy. Even then, he would somehow find a way to rebound, crush the invaders, and restore order. His leadership became legendary. He was kind of known as this fearless soldier amongst many great soldiers. And when panic gripped Rome during a barbarian incursion, it was Aurelian's presence alone was enough to reassure the people. The Senate even consulted the Sibylline books only to learn of his valor and kind of render him as this kind of divine aid in many ways when he was on the battlefield.
Yeah, there's a lot to unpack there of, the man, the myth, the legend. But we definitely know for sure his skill from a leadership standpoint. And I think him becoming this cavalry general and being so successful at it. And one of the things that I found was interesting was the type of cavalry that he was controlling and really leading, I should say. They're a form of light cavalry, so not a lot of armor, but very swift. So you have to think of, you can get into a skirmish, but you probably have to get out pretty quick because your horse is pretty exposed, your soldiers are pretty exposed, but they're quick. And so to be able to do that effectively, you need to be able to have your troops understand, hey, we're gonna go in, we're not gonna get bogged down, we're gonna roll back out, we're gonna come back in, and we're gonna kind of do more hit and run tactics. We're going to hold our lines where we need to. And we'll see that with him in his military, tactics. But to be able to get that to work, in the craziness and chaos of battle, I think is quite impressive. And I think you're right. We're starting to see already a little bit of a reputation as this great cavalry commander dealing with all of these invasions. And this is where the action really is. So you always see when there's a civil war, it's like, if it's a frontier general who's got troops with them, you better watch out because those guys are going to be pretty battle hardened and pretty experienced versus, a general from an interior province where they're not seeing a lot of action. So he's definitely coming from the right place to get the right type of experience.
Yeah, that's really good foreshadowing. It's almost like you read my notes it's almost like he's tailor-made kind of, someone who grew up in a rough provincial territory with brilliant military instincts. And even for our listeners who might not be super familiar with this period of history, this is definitely a weak point of mine. So I was looking, what did it actually mean to be in battle, for a Roman, not a Roman emperor yet, but as a commander in the army? They're out there. They're the front lines, essentially. They're leading their corps. They're in the face of battle. They're not directing it from, the backstage somewhere in a tent. Aurelian's out there fighting, and he's traveling thousands of kilometers on horseback. It's pretty incredible when you get into that level of detail, how battle-hardened you'd have to be to actually be able to consistently succeed and overcome all of the odds that he's facing at any given time.
Yeah, you're right. This isn't just some guy sitting in a tent pointing to things on a map. He's on a horse. He's got his sword. He's coming in, coming out, and really in this type of warfare, this level of close combat, you have to be close to your troops to be able to really understand what's going on, where your line's breaking, where you're going to get flanked, all of these sort of things, versus, someone like Napoleon who's looking at a more grander battlefield with, cannons and muskets and those sort of things, where the firearm and gunpowder is making those battlefields a lot bigger. Here, things are going to get really tight really quickly, and you got to be in the action if you're going to be able to lead those men.
Exactly. So I think at this point in time, he's probably one of Rome's most capable generals, and he's possessing the very qualities that are soon going to elevate him into the throne. But what does his actual path to power look like? So his path to the throne kind of unfolds during the chaos in between the years 268 and 270. So in 268, the emperor is assassinated during a siege, possibly with Aurelian's involvement, but this remains unclear. It's one of those mysteries of history that we'll never actually get to unpack. In the aftermath, Aurelian supports Claudius Gothicus, who became emperor and soon faced a massive Gothic invasion. Aurelian, as a top commander, played a key role in a very decisive Roman victory at a battle against the Goths, where the Goths were crushed. While Claudius earned the title Gothicus, much of the credit for the campaign and its success went to Aurelian, whose reputation as a battlefield leader grew substantially. And interestingly enough, fate intervenes again in the next year. So in early 270, Claudius dies from the plague, prompting a disputed succession. The Senate and some troops in Rome proclaimed Claudius's brother, Quintillus, as emperor. Though he's backed by the aristocracy, he lacks the support from the frontier armies. In the Danube region, battle-hardened legions instead turned to Aurelian, their trusted general. According to one source, the army refused to recognize the new emperor and instead declared Aurelian emperor around August 270. As had become kind of typical in a 3rd century crisis, the legions, prevailed over senatorial choice. And again, pretty common in this era, a brief civil conflict follows. Aurelian advances west with his loyal forces, while Quintilius is isolated in Italy trying to hold power. But his position actually collapses pretty quickly. He's abandoned by his troops, many of him who end up defecting to Aurelian, and he meets a pretty tragic end. Sources differ. Some claim suicide, others say his men killed him. Either way, after a reign of just few weeks, he's gone. And by late 270, Aurelian has emerged as the sole ruler of an empire. Again, a testament to his popularity amongst the troops and his readiness to seize the moment.
I think it's just a perfect microcosm and perfect example. When I said, hey, there's 26 emperors over this time period, and the average length of an emperor is like a year and a half. Well, here's the guy who lasted 2 weeks, right? So this is it's a perfect example of how quickly things can change. An emperor dies, there's no succession plan, so they're like, we'll pick his brother, and everyone's like, who's this guy? We've got this cavalry commander who's just been fighting alongside us the whole time, and the army picks the emperors now. The Senate doesn't have the power that it once did. Even Rome, the city, doesn't have the power that it once did. It's more symbolic at this point than anything, because so much fighting and so much power is really happening out on the frontiers. And next thing you know, you've gone through 3 emperors in a matter of a month. But now he's got the troops. The Senate's reluctantly agreed, but what can they do about it? And, now he's free to deal with the many, 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 many issues that a Roman emperor is going to have to face at this time.
And I think even as like a prelude to that, right? I don't think his rise was an accident in any meaningful way. You have loyal service to previous emperors. He earned his reputation as a dependable leader in a crisis. At the time of Claudius's death, Aurelian had commanded the very vital Danubian legions, arguably the empire's most powerful military force. And these troops troops revered him for victories against the Goths and other raiders. So in an age where, emperors were made by soldiers, Aurelian's bond with his army proved very decisive. He's able to really embody the opportunity and chances to act swiftly. He's promising stability, and he's been able to outmaneuver Quintilius and secure the throne within weeks. So he's battle tested, he's beloved, and he's determined to restore order.
What more can you need, right? He's got what he needs, and I think you're right. Like, he's got this. His troops are behind him, and they, like you said, revere him. And that's going to be so important because the job that he's going to have to do here, there's obviously a huge military component of it, but he needs loyalty and he needs stability within his own ranks. And he also needs kind of the fear of the rest of the empire to basically say, look, this guy's got the most powerful legions. There's no way they're ever going to defect from him. Okay, maybe I was thinking about becoming emperor, or if my troops want to declare me emperor, I'm going to, tell them to be quiet, very quickly. And that's, I think, what the empire really needs is this, a leader who is so capable, so strong, but also has such ridiculous amount of loyalty from the best troops in the empire. That's the perfect recipe for someone who's going to be able to be successful in a crisis like this.
And I think we've already kind of laid the land, but just to follow up, how does this kind of parallel in our minds, right? The context of what's going on in Rome at the time. He's inheriting a shattered empire teetering on collapse. One contemporary even observes that the empire nearly collapsed in the 260s under the weight of all these invasions and economic ruin. And here is Aurelian ready to restore order. And this is one of the things that really stood out to me, was that his reign, like we mentioned, was relatively short, but it's defined by near constant campaigning. So in a span of 5 years, he led his legions on this very extraordinary, martial odyssey from the plains of northern Italy to the deserts of Syria, from the Nile Delta to Gaul, and he fought a litany of enemies. We have Germanic tribes, Eastern troops, Gallic usurpers, and it was essentially victory after victory. And these campaigns, as we'll see, earned him the title of Restorer of the World, for by their end, the Roman Empire was whole again. And I think that's really the story we're trying to tell today.
Yeah, the Restorer of the World isn't a bad title at all. And I think this is probably a good time to just give a little bit of context on, I've been talking about this crisis he's got to deal with, and, a lot of the same problems. Currency's a mess. They're dealing with a ton of invasions from a variety of Germanic tribes coming over the Danube and over the Rhine. But at this point now, Rome is actually fractured into 3 separate entities. You have, we'll call it the Roman Empire proper. So that's basically, Italy, North Africa, all the Balkans, and kind of into Greece and moving into Turkey and a little bit into the Middle East, but that's starting to shift really quickly. But in 260, a person named Postumus basically took Gaul, which is France, Hispania, which is Spain, and Britain, which is Britain. We try to keep things easy here where we can, and created the Gallic Empire, and essentially as a breakaway state, and basically said, this is ours now, and said, all right, come and take it back if you want it. But if Rome itself can't figure out who's in charge and they're always fighting, this little empire is going to hang out for a while. And I say little in terms of in comparison to the Roman Empire, but this is a big empire. This is like, some pretty decent sized land. But where things are a little bit more interesting is in the east. So there's a city called Palmyra, and so it's in Syria. And Syria has been one of the most important provinces for Rome for a very long time because it borders the Parthian Empire and now the Sassanid Empire. And it's really that frontier empire. So you have really strong troops, just like the Danube. But the east has always been where the money is. You've got a lot of trade going back and forth throughout that region. And Palmyra actually becomes this trading post, this central hub where a lot of trade going east and west to the Middle East is happening. And the Palmyrans are starting to get very, very rich. And during this, multitude of crises, the Roman emperors of the time kind of gave Palmyra a little bit of independence and said, look, deal with the Parthians/Sassanids, deal with which were basically the Persians, deal with the Persians, and we'll give you a little bit of leeway. Bring up your own armies, really spend time on being that, a military first type of city. And they did that for a while, and they're very successful. They were able to hold off a lot of these invasions. When the Persians actually came into Syria, they were able to kind of kick them out and built a really great military foundation. And they're starting to get rich because of all this trade. But you might just start to see where this is going. If I'm in Palmyra and I'm looking west, I'm starting to look at the collapse of the Roman Empire and saying, is this really an empire I want to be a part of? And they're starting to say, no, not really. Look, we're making a lot of money. We got a great army. Why don't we take a little bit of slice of this for ourselves? And that's exactly what happened. So there's some assassinations that happen and a few other things. But really who rises out of this is someone called Queen Zenobia. So her husband, I believe, is assassinated. And so she basically starts running the show from Palmyra, and she's a little tongue-in-cheek about things. So she'll say things like, yeah, we're like a semi-independent sort of thing, but, we still have obedience to Rome, and we still, look at the emperor as our supreme leader. And what she's actually doing is taking her younger son and essentially putting him in as a puppet. It's the year 200, can't have a female leader, you need to have a male. And so she's using her son, but really she's controlling the show here. And she's got a lot of respect within Palmyra. And so she's doing little things where she's saying, my son isn't, I'm not going to call him Augustus, because that's Aurelian's role. He's the supreme leader, but I'm going to make coins where I put Aurelian's face on one side and I'm going to put my son's face on the other side, which is like not a direct punch at Aurelian to say, hey, I'm putting my son in charge and putting him over you, but I'm putting him on the same level. It's not saying he's better than you, but he's pretty much the same thing. And this starts to become a slippery slope after a while. She's starting to do more and more of this. And what she really starts to realize is at some point, all right, forget it. Actually, he is Augustus and he is going to start taking over. And they actually start to expand out of Palmyra. So they actually take over Syria. They move into Turkey. They actually go into Egypt, which, if we remember what Egypt, breadbasket of the empire, lots of grain coming out of there, lots of money. And so they've basically built this Palmyran empire in the east. And so now you have Rome fractured into this Gallic empire, the rest of the Roman empire kind of in the middle, and then this Palmyran empire out to the east. And so lots of different things are going on here. And, it's up to Aurelian. Okay, I got this Gallic empire. I got the Palmyrans. I've got to solidify my own power because he hasn't even been to Rome yet at this point. And I've got all these Gallic tribes, Germanic tribes, and all these different tribes flowing over the northern border. What do I got to deal with first? And that's the crisis for Aurelian at this point.
I think the Eastern Front represents a pretty unique challenge in some ways, right? Because it seems like the transition point was that Zenobia got bold. She takes Egypt, which is Rome's grain supply. She takes Anatolia. But what's the motive? Is it self-defense or is it expansion? And she begins issuing those coins with her own imperial titles. She's still kind of paying homage, but you can see the distinction. Now, you can imagine as Aurelian gets onto the scene, is this competition or is this someone we need to protect? And I think that transition is, we are no longer in a position where we have to deal with competition as much as we have because we were weakened. Now it's time to restore order and, secure our boundaries from any more expansionist threats.
Yeah, and I think she plays it very well. She plays that kind of like, he's not going to drop everything and go deal with me yet. But, okay, he's distracted with somewhere else. I'll take a little bit. And she knows the inevitable end to this, but I think she's trying to basically say, look, if I can build enough here, weaken Rome, strengthen my empire at the same time, maybe there's a peace that will come where we can figure something out here. Or maybe he marches down here and loses in battle and, we don't have to deal with the Romans anymore. Or we can look, even heaven forbid, to the Persians, maybe make a deal with them and use them as kind of we can become that buffer state between Rome and the Persians. So there's definitely a lot of things going on in her head, but you're right. She's bold. She's moving westward and taking some really key, really rich territories. And, for an empire that needs taxes, needs food, needs men, every little bit is going to, make that, reunification a little bit harder.
Yeah, and I think this is a great time to talk a little bit more detail about this particular campaign. So it's by the year 272, she's ruling much of the Eastern Empire in her son's name. But obviously, Aurelius needs to do something about this. So he's able to secure the Danube. So he begins marching east. His campaign moves pretty quickly. Many cities in Asia Minor surrendered without resistance. At Antioch, Zenobia's general deployed elite cavalry, but Aurelian used a ruse. He sent his light cavalry in to fake a retreat, luring the heavy Palmyrans into a trap. Overheated and exhausted, they were actually ambushed and crushed in a battle. This leads Zenobia to flee, where she regroups with a group of archers and allegedly elephants. After a brutal battle, Aurelian's infantry broke through. They forced another retreat, and during the siege, the queen supposedly tried to keep morale high. At one point, she even jeered Aurelian from the walls until one soldier famously shot down by an archer at the emperor's order, silencing the taunts. But eventually, she fled towards Persia, but was caught near the Euphrates and was returned in chains. She surrendered, and Aurelian showed restraint. The city was spared, and Zenobia was kept alive, reportedly to feature in in his Roman triumph. So in 2073, they actually rebel again, and they kill a Roman garrison. Aurelian returns with a fury, and he just razes the city. He's sending a clear message at this point that rebellion is no longer tolerated, and it's definitely not going to be tolerated twice. For his victories, the Senate titles him Restitutor Orientis and Parthicus Maximus. This is restorer of the East and great victor over the Parthians.
Yeah, I think, we make it kind of sound like in this quick time that we have to explain that he just kind of rolls in and deals with this. But like, this was not a slam dunk by any measure. And I think there's a few things he does along the way that I really like. He shows a lot of restraint, like a ton, like more than I think he needed to, just because he looks at all of this and he's like, look, I'm trying to be a restorer here. I can't start sacking towns. I need to show these towns and these cities that, yeah, you allied with the Palmyrans, but look, I get it. You're under pressure. If you want to come back on our side and open the gates, I got no problem with that. And he actually, this is where I think is really impressive. You got to let your soldiers loot. That's just the way it works back then. They're not out there always for just the love of, general and country. They want to get rich too. They want to let off some steam, if you will. But he shows so much restraint and doesn't really let them do that until that last piece where the Palmyrans come back a second time. And basically, the story goes that Aurelian left a general there and they started telling the general, hey, look, why don't we make you in charge and why don't you help us out? And he's like, yeah, sure, I'll do that. And he's writing Aurelian letters basically saying, you better get back here. We got some more butt kicking to do. And then he kind of lets his soldiers go loot in the traditional sense. So I think it's really a great strategy by him because he's very disciplined with his army. The soldiers love him, but he understands the bigger picture, and he isn't just the classic like man's man, soldier sort of guy where he's like, yeah, I'm just going to do whatever I can to make my troops happy. I'm going to put in discipline, and I'm not going to let them do always what they want to do, but they're still going to respect me because I am so great on the battlefield, and I'm there for them. And even to the example you mentioned about, his military tactics around, just making these heavy cavalry, which are really world renowned at this point, or at least renowned within the Mediterranean for their talent and their skill, tire them out, make them run a lot, and then get them spread out and then crush them in that sense. Even in the final battle against the Palmyrans, they've learned their lesson, so they don't do that again. But there's a point where it actually looks like Aurelian's going to lose the battle, and he does this crazy thing where he tells his infantry to essentially turn around and go support his cavalry, kind of running across an open plain, trying to go take out these cavalry, which again is bold moves from, Queen Zenobia, bold move after bold move from Aurelian. And everything just seems so disciplined with him. And so he takes the risks when he needs to, but he's got these troops that are so disciplined, during the battle, after the battle, marching to the battle. And I think that's really what comes down to, all of this success where he gets to come back to Rome and finally have this big triumph where he's, able to be celebrated as the conqueror and restorer that he is.
I think there's a great element there of this whole like restoration piece and strategic thinking, right? Like he is going to let his soldiers loot because, that's how it works back then. But he's also willing to save face, right? He's not going to sentence Zenobia to death. He easily could if he really wanted to, and no one would have batted an eye. And I think that type of strategic thinking is very interesting because he wants to restore order, not necessarily create more chaos. And I think it's a really interesting nuance. And we actually see an example of it in the Western campaign as well when he defeats the Gallic Empire. So this is actually an interesting story. So at this time, the empire is ruled by Tetricus I, and Gaul had been under breakaway control since around the year 260 CE. But by 274, the regime's kind of faltering under internal dissent and external threats. And legend holds, and this is very funny, Tetricus was overwhelmed by mutinous troops. He had secretly sent a plea to Aurelian, rescue me from this barn. Whether it's true or not, when the two armies met, he surrendered, and his soldiers offered very little fight, and the empire collapsed, ending 14 years of separation. Here's the interesting part, though. Instead of punishing him, Aurelian gave him governorship in Italy. His son was also allowed to join the Roman Senate, and these acts weren't just generous. These are strategically intelligent moves in my thinking. He is essentially removing the allure of martyrdom from his rivals and easing this reintegration process into the empire. And I think it's just a fascinating and extremely strategic move that's going to pay off.
Yeah, you're right, because the Palmyrans separated for a reason. The Gallic Empire separated for a reason. It wasn't just because of Queen Zenobia, or it wasn't just because of Tetricus. There was something bubbling there, and there was opportunity. And so there's no need to give them another opportunity. There's no need to cut off a head and say, no, I've created a martyr for you. But he's also clever as well. Okay, Tetricus, I'm going to let you live, but you're going to live in Italy, and you're going to kind of live under my watch. And yeah, I'll let your son join the Senate, but he's still going to be under my watch. And I think that's a pretty clever move in terms of get them out of the environment where they were causing trouble, get them into an environment where they can live and not cause too much trouble, but, not put them in a place where, they're going to have a certain amount of power and I can't keep my eye on them. And I think it's a great move from that point. And there's one other thing I wanted to bring up too, and you may have been noticing as we talked about Aurelian. So it's just like, if you look at a map of where he's doing things, you see him early in his career dealing with all these invasions from the north, coming into Italy, into the Balkans. And you just kind of see, okay, he's moving around. He's taking his army here. He's taking them there. He's bringing them back. Okay, I got to go to Palmyra. Oh, I'm halfway back to the west. Oh, the Palmyrans rebel again, so I got to go all the way back down and kick their butts again. Okay, now I got to go out west. I got to deal with some stuff there. And I always wondered, doesn't he have got guys for this? Can't he delegate? And really, this is a perfect example of the crisis of the 3rd century. What some emperors mistakenly did was had a second in command, a third in command, and said, yeah, you deal with the Danube frontier. Okay, great. I'm going to deal with all of these tribes. Oh my God, 50,000 Goths are coming over the border, and I'm going to win a spectacular battle. That was pretty good win by me. Hey, I think I can do a little bit more than this. My troops love me. Some of them are saying I should be emperor. You know what? They're right. I am going to become emperor. I declare myself as emperor. And then a civil war comes out. And so now we're getting to the point where if Aurelian's not with his army and he's just learning from what's happened in the past, letting somebody else win, and if the army's picking the winner and he's not, in the weeds every single time, there's a big risk. And there are obviously opportunities where he's, going after the Palmyrans and he's sending another general, south into Alexandria, and then they're going to meet up, and he's leaving some troops to deal with the Gallic Empire under a different general. But he's still very strategic that when those big battles need to happen, he needs to be the head of that, and he needs to have kind of that glory, and I guess the win needs to be credited to him, because if it's not, all you need is a couple wins by a certain general and a couple troops to kind of go, I didn't really like Aurelian's discipline, or I really like this guy, for this whole thing to, explode again. That's
such a great, keen insight, because I think it really does speak to his understanding of the situation, right? If we're having this conversation and he's, having a second or third in command, but Rome is stable, maybe it's not such a bad move. But, he's keenly aware of the lack of stability that exists, that if someone does have the idea of becoming emperor, it's still not going to be that hard for them to do. And then, here we are again in the midst of another civil war.
Definitely. It's a tricky balance to have. And you can see why the empire is going to need some reform soon, because you can't have one guy running around trying to deal with all of this. And one of the things that he actually does, and if you go to Rome today and you see the walls in Rome, they're actually called the Aurelian walls. And the reason for that is when a lot of these tribes were coming in from the north, the frontier cities were pretty well defended, but the interior cities, even including Rome, really had lackluster defenses. And so you start to see these tribes come in and show up to a massive city and just essentially sack the whole city because, the barbarians are known for not being very good at siege warfare. So they see a walled city and they just try to go around it and then go to the next unwalled city. And so that's the one thing Aurelian realizes. He goes, I have to put better walls around Rome. And so he builds this massive network of walls. And that's kind of part of his big legacy. But this is a big change for Rome too, because for so long it was like, barbarians in Italy? Come on, that's never going to happen. What do we need to deal with Rome's defenses for? But now they're starting to see that, yes, this barbarian invasion from the north will continue on. And it's been happening for a long time. And there's so many things kind of happening within that region to push these tribes, more south. But we're starting to get to this point now where he's starting to think a little bit around, what reforms can I start to make to our defenses to really shore up what we're having to defend, and making sure that not just, the outer parts of the empire have really good defenses. We have to be prepared for an army to slip through the cracks and even potentially make it their way to Rome.
Yeah, I always find that when we're in the midst of these episodes, I keep thinking back to other leadership characteristics, especially when we're talking about Roman emperors. And there's always this balancing act of, okay, deal with external threats. Cool. That's done. Okay. Now what do we do internally from a domestic standpoint, right? And you can see the shift here. So we're starting to, wrap up our military campaigns. We need to think about consolidating our strength and fortifying our defenses for any future threats. But at the same time, while he's waging relentless military campaigns, he's also pursuing, vital internal reforms to stabilize the state from within. Because, I imagine he's confronted with the reality that, victory on the battlefield isn't going to mean much without addressing addressing some of the like systemic crises that the people are dealing with, economic, administrative, spiritual, that are threatening Rome's survival internally.
Yeah, there's a lot of stuff that's coming, and one of the ones I really like is, this is not a good look if you're a great general, and Rome is just used to expanding and expanding, is the territory of Dacia or Dacia, basically Romania today, or big part of Romania, is kind of like, if you look at the Roman Empire, you kind of see this like part that's kind of juts out over the Danube River. He basically looks at that and goes, that's a lot of territory to defend. It's not as rich as it once was. And I've got the areas south of the Danube just don't have enough people, and I need to repopulate it. So he actually decides to pull Rome out of that territory, sign some peace treaties with the tribes in the areas, and basically says, look, anybody who's Roman in that area, we'll get you some land south of the river, and we're going to actually reduce the size of our northern border by hundreds of miles. It's because, we have such limited manpower at this point. I need every single bit of that border defended. And so it's a really smart move because he has such limited resources, but there's always a little bit of this. This is the first time Rome has ever declined in size in pretty much ever. It's always expanding, other than for these temporary little changes. But this is the first time that they've really just given up a province that they're never going to get back. And yeah, it's the right move, but there's still a little bit of like, he's got to really think through this decision. And again, I think he's established himself enough at this point, but these are the types of reforms that he's really thinking that we're fighting more of a defensive war now than more of an expansionist war. And that's, a big change for Rome, especially as, we're really just trying to get stable at this point and really not trying to be, the Rome of 200 years ago where we're expanding like there's no tomorrow and, it seems like there's no end in sight.
It's a dangerous precedent to set potentially, right? To be declining or potentially withdrawing from a state or region that you've governed over. But I think this is like very insightful on his part because, he's counterbalancing potentially some of his policies that, might be supporting the people at home. It's all about optics at the end of the day. So yeah, he's withdrawing from a region, but what else is he doing to help the people? There's currency reforms. Right? By the time he takes power, the economy is reeling. Years of debasement had turned silver coins into worthless copper, fueling inflation. No one really trusted the currency anymore. So he relaunches a, currency reform, and he issues a higher quality coin and attempts to recalibrate the monetary system. So this actually involved recalling the worst coins and making new ones with value guarantees. And the reform's obviously going to be met by massive resistance from people who have been doing pretty well, through forms of corruption or tax evasion, who have been benefiting from the chaos. But, he reinforces his hard stance that internal treachery is dangerous and it's as bad as foreign invasion, essentially. And whoever is not in line with this is going to face the same iron hand. And kind of doubling down on this, in a very striking populist move, he actually cancels public debts by burning state records. This actually mirrored a similar act by Hadrian and helped ease economic pressure on citizens and merchants. So again, it's going to stimulate commerce during a period of fiscal fragility. And like we mentioned, he's investing in infrastructure, not just defensively, but he's repairing roads, bridges. He's securing grain shipments from Egypt. He's doing a lot to help and stabilize, social life and political life for the people of Rome.
And it must just be a breath of fresh air for the Roman people at this point, because it's just the chaos that's happening within Rome itself and the empire itself, and, the debasement of currency and the uncertainty of what the futures are going to hold. You can see why he becomes so popular, at this time of just, dealing with a lot of the larger issues. And, when riots come out with, well, at least they attempt to riot after he starts dealing with some of these corrupt mints, they don't last very long. And I think for the most part, people kind of get what's happening, but yeah, it's necessary stuff. It may not be popular, but we keep seeing that it's tough with his troops. He's pulling out of regions, but he's been able to do all of that because he's so great on the battlefield, and he's, the restorer of the world. Kind of puts a lot of credibility behind, any little action you might make, whether it's, foreign policy or domestic policy.
Yeah, I think in many ways, the idea he's here for a good time, not a long time, kind of comes to mind, because in those 5 years, he's essentially this relentless reformer who reforms Rome's broken economy. He restores state authority and he's trying to purge corruption and just be brutally efficient while he's doing it. And, his policies seem pretty forceful, but I think in many ways, at least from what historians interpret, they lay the groundwork for future stability for other emperors to come.
Definitely. Can we talk about Sol Invictus now? I've been very patient, but I think we have to. Do you want to introduce it?
Sure. Yeah, this is interesting. It doesn't really fit the rest of the narrative, but I think it's definitely one of those historical footnotes that our listeners will appreciate. So Aurelian also used religion to forge unity in a very fragmented empire. So he elevated Sol Invictus, the unconquered sun. I'll let that sink in for a second. As Rome's supreme deity. He actually built a grand temple for Sol Invictus and lavishly endowed it with treasures from Palmyra. He established a new priesthood and games in Sol's honor, presenting the sun god as a divine patron of imperial authority. Coins from his reign show Sol crowning Aurelian, accompanied by the phrase, the rising son of the emperor. And this essentially aligns cosmic power with imperial legitimacy, which is a pretty massive shift for Rome at this time. And his devotion may have had some personal roots, like we had mentioned earlier, that his mother was, this so-called priestess of the sun. And he actually formalized Sol's birthday as December 25th, a date, as we all know, with very significant Christian significance. And I think a very important takeaway for our listeners here, and this is more like historical scholarly view, but this is kind of like that first step towards monotheism and kind of imperial religiosity centralization, where, you're anticipating Constantine's embrace of Christianity. But Aurelian wasn't, persecuting other faiths, but he's promoting religious unity through this kind of state-sanctioned devotion.
We need to double down on how big of a deal this is, because Christianity is really starting to grow in the empire now. It's not some backwater religion that people kind of hear about and kind of whisper behind the scenes. It's starting to actually have a bit of street cred, if you will. Constantine's only 40 years away. And so up to this point, Rome has been polytheistic. You have, Jupiter and Neptune and all of these gods that are essentially the Roman versions of, Zeus, Poseidon, Hades, those, I guess that's set up, if you will. But to have a singular cosmic type of thing to worship, whether it is the sun god or, whatever god, from a monotheistic standpoint you want to choose, this is it's a bit of a change, because it happens and people don't go crazy about it, which is one thing, which tells you there's this appetite for change from a religious standpoint. And we'll get into this in future episodes of how this change actually happens, but it's just something to kind of take away of, it isn't Christianity, but December 25th as Sol's feast day, you'll see why that transition is going to be a little bit easier if you're always kind of wondering of how did Rome go from polytheism into Christianity. It's not just flipping a switch. There's always these intermediary jumps, and, Aurelian and Sol Invictus is, I think, cannot be understated how big of a transition point this is going to be for at least the people to be able to embrace, Constantine's decision.
Yeah, I really think it speaks to the evolution of what's happening at the ground level, right? You're not going to get this type of buy-in or support this easily if the populace isn't hungry or thirsty for some sort of change in direction or shift in, religious belief.
Yeah, definitely. And it's a big change, but it's also kind of one that just is encompassing, there's so much change and so much chaos and things aren't the best that, maybe I think you mentioned it off the top too, Rich. He was maybe the gods don't really care for us anymore. Maybe we're not in favor of the gods, and it's a little bit easier to maybe pull away and start thinking about something else. And hey, okay, wait a second. Things are actually going quite well now. Maybe I will pray to the Sol Invictus. Maybe I will go to the new Temple of Sol. These are the types of things, especially for Romans who are very, very religious and very superstitious. This stuff matters. And, we'll see as time goes on that this is going to be very important.
So I think in many respects, as we come up on the hour mark, his reign is transformative in every respect of emperorship, from military conquest all the way to governance. He moves swiftly, decisively, and he's always acting with the empire's survival in mind. And just as he's reaching the height of his power, fate always has a funny way of striking at the most imperfect time. In 275 CE, the restorer of the world is assassinated. And sadly, it's not by enemy swords, but by a conspiracy amongst his own staff. So Aurelian was actually preparing for a campaign against the Persians, seeking to avenge past Roman humiliations. And as his army passed through Thrace, a deadly scheme unfolded. A secretary who had committed some transgressions previously, perhaps embezzlement, and fearing Aurelian's wrath, forged a fake death list, and it falsely claimed Aurelian planned to execute several of his top officers. Terrified, these men believed the lie, and then rather than risk execution, they conspired to strike first. And in September 275, the conspirators ambushed and murdered Aurelian. Caught unaware, the emperor had obviously no chance to resist, and the man who had survived countless battles didn't end up dying on the battlefield, but by betrayal. And, obviously the shock is immense. Aurelian was around 60 at this time, and he's adored by his troops, and his assassination was not widely supported, and it stemmed from fear and misinformation, and even the officers involved were overcome with such guilt and grief once the truth came out. And apparently his wife actually, who was present, assumed temporary control, becoming one of the few women to rule Rome in practice. Coins were even minted in her name, but that is the untimely end of probably one of the most effective emperors in Roman history.
Yeah, it's really a sad end, but also just tells you how history can really just turn on a dime so quickly. Maybe that list doesn't get created, or maybe one of those guys says, this is a great idea, or tips Aurelian off, and who knows what's next, right? Who knows? He stays in power longer, and maybe Constantine doesn't come along in the same way that he does, and maybe Christianity doesn't spread in the same way, and, a million other things happen, and, it's a completely different world. And so, I love kind of thinking about those sort of things, because one or two big decisions in history, if they gone the other way, could radically change the world we live in today, which is kind of what we like to do here, to try to understand the world we live in today. But yeah, it's again, it is fitting for the crisis of the 3rd century that even a great emperor who's actually doing the right thing and doing very well is still going to get caught up in these jealousy, everybody's scared, whatever you want to call it. This is just what happens at this time, and it's really unfortunate, because you're right, he's done so much. And I think what I always walk away from is, you read through his bio, and then when you say he's only in power for 5 years, it always seems like there's got to be a mistake somewhere, surely. Like, he's got to go all the way to Syria, he's got to come all the way back, and he's got to do a bunch of stuff along the way. That should be a year or two tops, at the very least, or I should say at the very least. And he's still got time to do, all of these other things. And so, yeah, a very untimely death for someone who, like you said, is at the absolute pinnacle of Roman emperors at his peak. But, the longevity really wasn't there for anything he did wrong. Just, maybe not having a great spy network or something to really defend him like maybe some other emperors did. But yeah, it's just, that's history for you, right? That's the great thing I love about history is there's no plot holes. There's no nothing in the story. This is what happened. And unfortunately for him, it's an early end.
Well, and I think this is a great segue into future episodes, because I think what we can explore preceding this is that he really does lay the foundation for future emperors to kind of take off where he left, even untimely as it was.
Absolutely. And, some historians have said, his work really paves the way for Diocletian and Constantine to lay these new foundations for the Roman state in a completely different form. And so when we talk about great emperors, Diocletian and Constantine right up at the top. And I don't think they can get to where they get to unless Aurelian kind of does some of this groundwork to stabilize things a little bit and, remind the enemies of Rome really who's in charge. But, again, this is just, the way it ends for him. And, we'll have to see in future episodes how this all comes together. But yeah, it's not bad for a legacy for 5 years, for someone who's been able to do everything that he did. And really the only time that we've talked about, at least in Roman history, where not only do you have challenges and plagues, but you actually have two massive parts of the empire fully break away and become independent, and you have like a proper full-on civil war. And, and he's able to bring that back together and do it only in 5 years, which is, again, still crazy to even say.
Yeah, nothing short of incredible.
Definitely. So, yeah, I think we'll be back next time where we're going to kind of continue this story, and we've foreshadowed enough that there's some pretty big players coming along in the next couple episodes. So stay tuned for that. And, we'll see where Aurelian's hard work and his, unfortunately early death will lead for the Roman Empire.
Thanks for listening, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to today's episode of the History in Motion podcast. If you enjoyed our journey through time, please subscribe, rate us, share the podcast with friends. Your support helps keep history alive. Until next time.